In August of 1944, a group of men from a dozen nations met in the cool California summer to discuss plans for the formation of an organization to promote peace and cooperation in a world that was currently consumed in a brutal world war. When those dozen men left at the end of the month of October, they had drawn up plans for an international organization that would forever alter the global community's understanding of rights and responsibilities. That organization would be the United Nations. The United Nations was an organization formed in the throes of the world's most devastating conflict, one that by its end, in the summer of 1945, would claim the lives of nearly 50 million people across the globe. The main purpose set forth by the charter delegates of the United Nations at the Dumbarton Oaks, California meeting was to create an entity that in the post-war years would ensure international stability. It was at the gates of Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald that the Americans and the European allies first began to understand that this war was now far more than just a military struggle. It was a struggle of the human condition. It fell to the Allied nations to take on new responsibilities to protect and safeguard the rights of those conquered peoples across Europe and Asia. These understandings all weighed heavily on the minds of the UN delegates as they basked in the pleasant San Francisco sun and drafted what would become the Charter of the United Nations, which would be ratified on June the 26th, 1945. The members of the UN understood that the maintenance of the old order would do nothing but create further strife and dissent in the world. In the minds of the leaders of the early United Nations, intervention to resolve conflict and tear down the old geopolitical system, be it military or diplomatic, was the new mandate of the international community. The United Nations, after its official inception in 1945, immediately went about doing what the League of Nations was unable to do, bring some type of civilized order in the chaos of the immediate post-war years. Israel and other former colonial states owe their existence to the early diplomatic interventionist works of the United Nations. The UN also began actively deploying peacekeeping soldiers to ensure peace through strength in countless nations. The role of the United Nations peacekeeping forces would undergo their greatest and most publicized tests in the 1990s, in the powder keg of the Balkan Peninsula, specifically in a forgotten little nation called Bosnia. Bosnia, by the time the Soviet Union and its subsidiary states collapsed in 1991 and throughout 1992, was an unknown location even to the most seasoned diplomat. By the fall of 1992, though, Bosnia and her sister nations were engrossed in a forgotten but brutal civil war. Yugoslavia, a nation precariously placed on the edge of Christian Europe and Muslim Asia Minor, was a compilation of a dozen ethnic groups and religious factions, many of which had long and proud histories of fratricidal bloodshed. The iron hand of Joseph Broz Tito and the Yugoslav Communist Party quelled these ethnic tensions for almost 50 years, but the destruction of the communist apparatus quickly led to an upsurge in ethnic tensions that would eventually boil over into an all-out war. The principal belligerents in the Yugoslav Civil War were Orthodox Christian Serbs, led by the dogmatic but brutal strongman Slobodan Milosevic, and Catholic Croatia, led by the equally dogmatic and brutal Franjo Tuđman. Caught in the geographic middle of the two was tiny Bosnia, a loose confederation of Croats, Serbs, Muslims, and Slovenians. As the war between Croatia and Serbia intensified, both sides understood that Bosnia was a crucial strategic point, and soon became the focal point for major offensives on both sides. Numerous innocent Bosnian cities were laid siege to, many with seemingly no military value at all. The historic and beautiful city of Sarajevo, Bosnia's largest city, became the most brutal poster child of this Balkan war, a burned-out husk of its former self, home to countless mines, snipers, and hapless civilians who were easy prey for them and the Serb artillery spotters in the hills overlooking the city. As reports of mass bloodshed and rumors of concentration camps filtered back into Western Europe, the matter was brought to the attention of the United Nations, which, in a unanimous Security Council vote, decided to send 15,000 peacekeepers to the region. Before the first UN transport arrived, international news crews made the long and arduous journey to the region and began to document, to the extent that they could, the atrocities in the region. They would play an integral role, albeit unknowingly, in shaping the course of the UN peacekeeping mission. Since major UN commanders understood that every move they made was carefully filmed and scrutinized by the international media, and thus the international population at large, this posed a major problem for the UN. A problem that they had never faced before and were woefully unprepared for. Because from the start, the UN operation was a debacle. The belligerent armies, especially the Serb-dominated Yugoslav National Army, vastly outgunned and outnumbered the small, under-equipped UN units. Serb and Croat leaders also keenly understood the diplomatic limitations of the peacekeepers. Here the UN mission was permanently hobbled, ironically by the UN's own ideological underpinnings. So respectful of the sovereignty of nations to which they deployed troops, and so anxious to avoid further bloodshed and instability, the UN refused to allow its soldiers to engage Serb, Croat, or the rare Bosnian military unit, even if they were in the process of massacring innocent civilians. They could return fire if fired upon, but no Balkan soldier was dumb enough to make that mistake. The most notorious incident of the UN's limitations came in 1995, in the Muslim enclave of Srebrenica, which had been declared a safe zone by the UN and was guarded by about 1,000 lightly armed Dutch soldiers.
I could see some...
When Serb forces rolled up to the Dutch roadblock and demanded entrance, the peacekeepers, unable to actually stop the Serbs from entering the city, acquiesced. Within days, over 5,000 people were dead, and 1,000 more would die from starvation or exposure in the months to come.
There was a stream of people coming down the street.
The news media was present, of course, to observe all of this, and the public opinion of the United Nations and its abilities quickly dried up. The public failed to understand the extremely complex diplomatic factors in the region, or how peacekeepers who were sent to protect the citizens of this troubled land could stand by and allow them to be wantonly butchered. And so the UN peacekeeping mission in Bosnia went. The numbers of peacekeepers grew, but the mandate under which they operated and the restrictions placed on them never changed. UN peacekeepers were likewise deployed to the Albanian enclave of Kosovo, which was under assault by the Serb army in 1998, but again, it failed to stop the senseless bloodshed that soon engulfed the region. Both times peace only came with the deployment of heavily armed NATO contingents, which had no such diplomatic limitations, and after intensive NATO air campaigns against Serb positions. The story of the UN involvement in the Balkans is a sorry one. For all their good intentions, the UN had bogged its own agents of action down in a mire of bureaucracy. Not only did the mandate of the mission prevent the well-intentioned peacekeepers from using force to keep peace in a nation where force was the only credible measure of power, but the complex power structure of the UN forced peacekeepers to attain authorization before even defending themselves. To the officials at the UN, it was clear that the rights and responsibilities of nations had changed since the Second World War, and that isolationist policies of non-intervention would no longer be sufficient to achieve lasting peace in this world. Unfortunately, the UN's hyper-interventionist philosophy forced it into situations that it was no longer suited to deal with.
The effort to put peacekeepers in a context where there was no peace to keep and hope that this would somehow contribute to a durable solution was exposed as folly. It also, I think, exposed as folly the painful even-handedness of the UN mission in Bosnia when, in fact, everyone recognized that there was an aggressor.
And the inflexible nature of the UN mandate, caused by the desire to maintain peace and prevent chaos, made preventable catastrophes like those in Bosnia all the more tragic. The formation of the United Nations 50 years ago marked a drastic shift in the way the international community, especially the powerful nations of the West, view their responsibilities to the rest of the world. They've gained an understanding that the nations that have the ability to safeguard the rights of others were obliged to do so, whether through unilateral or multilateral means. And with the formation of the United Nations came a whole smattering of international organizations, NATO, the European Common Market, and the like. As time drew on, however, the United Nations began to lose its effectiveness, at least as a large-scale military force, as it became increasingly concerned over violating the rights of belligerent nations and their citizens. For the time being, the United Nations is still an effective diplomatic institution, and there is no better forum for statesmen to truly speak to the rest of the world of protecting the rights of the oppressed through the force of arms.